All right, so we're going to pick up this evening with Chapter 6. If you want to go ahead and take out your slides for Chapter 6, if you do that during class. And we want to talk about land use controls. These are the restrictions or regulations that are put on property not by the grantor. Remember, we talked about way back in Chapter 2. Don't forget that stuff. Remember, you're going to have to learn it, know it still at the end of the class. We learned back in Chapter 2 how a grantor might restrict the use of a property. Remember, we talked about like life estates restrict the time that the grantee would own the property, but the grantor could also restrict the use with like a fee simple defeasible or fee simple
determinable,
fee simple determinable estate. Well, that's all well and good. But what if there are restrictions there that aren't being placed by the grantor? And that's what this chapter is about. These are restrictions that are already in place that the new owner, because we just talked about transferring title, so we got a new owner, is going to have to follow. That's what this chapter is all about. The new owner having to follow certain rules and regulations, and they could be from a government agency, they could be private things like covenants, for example, but there are going to be some type of rules, regulations, restrictions that limit what the new owner can do with their new property. And so that's what this chapter is all about, is controls. Now, this slide may seem completely meaningless. I cannot stress to you enough how important this slide is. This slide is probably the most important slide in the entire chapter, because if you truly understand what's on this slide, you will get a lot of questions right about Chapter 6, even if you don't know any other information. Land can be restricted by two different groups of people. The restrictions can come from the public, from the government, from us as society. These are laws. These are government regulations. These are things like planning and zoning regulations. Those things come from the government. Now here's where you're going to, if you don't pay attention to this, you're going to miss a boat ton of test questions about this. If the restriction comes from the government, guess who enforces the restriction? Who makes sure people follow that restriction? If the restriction comes from the government, who's going to make sure you follow that restriction?
The government.
The government. Now, go one level deeper. What arm of the government is the enforcement arm of the government? What extension of any government entity enforces the rules?
Judicial.
Law enforcement.
Even go deeper than law enforcement, even deeper than the judicial branch, because the judicial branch just issues orders. Ultimately, who carries out those orders? It's law enforcement. So when you get test questions, and you will, from this chapter, about what steps somebody would need to take if they see somebody violating a rule or a restriction, I 100% guarantee you, if you will just step back for a second and go, is that a public restriction or is that a private restriction? And you can get the question right. You can get the answer to the question right. If it's public, who's going to enforce it?
The law.
The law.
The police.
The police.
If it's a public restriction, it's going to be enforced by the police. Now, police can mean actual police, as in a police department. It could mean a sheriff's department. It could mean some type of government, entity like the Bureau of Land Management or somebody like that, but some law enforcement agency. Public controls are enforced by the police. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
So if you see somebody violating a public control, who do you call?
The
The
police.
police.
You call the police, some extension of police. Now remember, definition of police is any government-based group whose job it is to enforce that regulation. So a planning and zoning office, would that be an example of police in this sense, of police power?
Yes.
It absolutely would. Now, the other type of restrictions are private restrictions or non-government restrictions.
So it's like a HOA type.
So these would be covenants, HOAs, all those kinds of restrictions on property. Now, let me ask you this. Who do you think's not going to enforce these things? Who do you not call for these?
You don't call the police for those.
Don't call the police. Right there, you just got like 2 questions right on the final exam. I guarantee you. Because it sounds right to say, oh, call the police. Don't call the police if it's a covenant they're violating. They got nothing to do with that. Because violating a covenant is not the same thing as violating a law. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Police or law enforcement enforce the law. Covenants are not the law. Covenants are private restrictions that have been placed on the property at some point in the past. And the restrictions were placed either on one single property or more likely on several properties all at one time, called a subdivision. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So now here's the other half of the magic question to getting most of the stuff right from this chapter, even on slide 1.
Hey, Travis.
Yes, go ahead, Jay.
So really quick. I'm like in a spotty area. Are the classes recorded so we can go back and review it ourselves?
Yes.
Do you send that link or should I reach out to Seth?
You can simply go to my my YouTube page, and there's a playlist there called Online Prelicensing, and I'm posting them there as we finish them.
Okay, thank you. I'm in the mountains, so it's spotty. So
That's all right.
that's why I was.
All right.
Thanks.
Travis, before we move on, quick question. Now I'm looking in the notes. When you up under public land use controls, it has subdivision regulation. What do they mean by that?
So that's a great question. Creating subdivisions is a law thing. So the process you have to go through to create a subdivision is a law thing. Whatever restrictions you place on the subdivision is not a law thing. That's a private restriction. So don't call the police. If you've got a covenant in your neighborhood that says you can't have your trash cans in front of the house, this is going to be a test question. And Bob has got his trash cans in front of the house. How can that be enforced? How can that covenant be enforced?
That can be
You
enforced
contact
by
HOA.
both.
Right there, go to the HOA.
Because the city of Raleigh will fine you for not doing that in your HOA.
That's not, Beth, that's not what I asked. I said there's a covenant against that. I didn't say there was a law against it. There might be in certain places, but I just said there's a covenant against it. And the covenant will not be enforced by any government entity. Now, I did hear people say HOA, which is close to right. But
Well,
this is where
Travis.
Yes, go ahead, Kim.
So in this instance, because I live in that neighborhood, I'm part of the HOA, I can enforce it myself, right?
You individually enforce it. And that's the answer they're looking for. They're not looking for HOA as an answer. Because here's the truth, folks. There are lots of neighborhoods that have covenants that do not have a functioning homeowners association. That doesn't mean the covenants cannot be enforced. Whose responsibility is it to enforce covenants? Always.
The neighbors, everybody in the neighborhood.
Neighbors. And how many neighbors does it take to enforce a covenant?
Only one, really.
Just one. That's going to be the answer they're looking for every single time on the test, because that's legally the case.
What does that even mean to enforce it as a private individual though? You got just going over there and saying something?
Well, you can attempt to go over there and say something, and if they don't, that's a good question. If they don't follow through with following the covenant, how do any two private citizens legally settle a dispute with each other?
In a court of law.
Lawsuit.
One sues the other.
Oh,
So
wow.
the neighbor who thinks that the covenants are being violated can file a lawsuit against the neighbor who is violating the covenants. And here's the interesting thing. Not only can the neighbor who files the lawsuit enforce the covenants and ask the court to say, okay, they got their trash cans in front of the house and they're not supposed to have that. If they win, and if the rules say you can't, they will win. Not only will the offending neighbor have to remove their trash cans, they'll also have to pay all those court costs and attorney's fees that were associated with suing.
Wow.
So there's some real teeth to covenants. Now, whether people actually avail themselves of this and do it is a whole other story. But that is always possible, and that's the answer they're going to be looking for. All the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about in this chapter is window dressing compared to just understanding the difference between a private land use control and a public land use control. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Okay. Because it does matter. Some examples of public land use controls, there's lots of them. Planning and zoning, we're going to talk about some in detail. Subdivision creation, this was a good question that Kelly asked. The creation of subdivisions is regulated by public law, but what is actually enforced as far as the rules within those subdivisions is not enforced by the public. That's a private type control. Building codes are an example of a public limitation or land use control. Environmental rules, all of those are public controls. The most common and the one that you're likely going to be tested on is zoning. You don't need to know anything on this slide other than just for reference purposes that this plan exists in every city or county in North Carolina, something called a master zoning plan. Zoning is an example of police power because it's a public land use control. It gives your local government the right to enforce the land use controls called zoning. Now, how many of you are familiar with zoning or have heard of it? What do you think the purpose of zoning is? What, somebody want to volunteer what you think the purpose of zoning is? I mean, before you make life miserable, but I get that. But what else?
Like in zoning prevents someone from, let's just say all houses in the neighborhood are like 3,500 square feet. Will it prevent you from adding 10,000 additional square feet onto your home?
It could potentially, depending on what the zoning regulations were. It could limit the size of an addition. John said in the chat to protect neighboring landowners. That's a really good way of looking at it, because without zoning regulations, there would be very little to prevent someone from coming in, for example, next to a residential neighborhood and putting a hog farm. Would that be a desirable development if you owned property next door to that land and it was all of a sudden developed as a hog farm and you had to
Not at all.
And so zoning is a way to plan in advance so that we don't end up with that kind of hodgepodge, hit and miss thing. Now, here's what I'm going to say. Every municipality in North Carolina has the same amount of power as far as zoning goes. Not every municipality in North Carolina will exercise that power to the same degree. There are some cities or towns or counties which exert a lot more of their authority when it comes to zoning regulations. And then there are some, like for example, I'm from Edgecombe County. I'm pretty sure if you wanted to build anything anywhere at any time in Edgecombe County, the planning and zoning office would not get in your way. And I'm not even saying that in an insulting way. I'm saying that because here's how I know they would be so excited you were building something in Edgecombe County. My mom's sister called me a couple months ago and she said, "Oh, did you know there was a house being built on my way to work?" And I said, "How would I know there's a house being built on your way to work?" "Oh, I just thought you might have heard." Like, it's big news. She drives 20 miles to work. This is an announcement that there's a house being built somewhere in that 20-mile strip. She thought that was newsworthy. If you're in that county, you're not going to have a lot of engagement from the planning and zoning people, most likely telling you what you can and cannot do, because they're thankful for the development. But I saw John mention another municipality located in North Carolina, which takes a very different approach to exercising their authority over how things are built, where they are built. Cary, which is where I currently live. How many of you have visited Cary before? Does Cary have sort of a consistent look and feel when you drive around it? Now, whether you like that or not, it's a different question, but does it have sort of a consistent, it looks like Cary? I mean,
Yes.
you know,
I
every
like it.
shopping center looks the same. The entrance to the neighborhoods all look relatively the same. The
Street signs, everything.
There are no billboards anywhere. Have you ever noticed that? You know that? You know why there are no billboards in Cary? They're not
Ordinances.
allowed.
Yeah.
They're not allowed in the planning and zoning ordinances in Cary. Cary exercises their zoning authority to a very great extent. So what you have to recognize is that a lot of choice will be up to buyers about where they want to purchase property, because some people find that very desirable, you know, that sort of controlled development. And some people think that's just like oppressive. And nobody's right or wrong, by the way. Everybody has their preference about it. So yeah, that's right. Yeah, Gypsy Shiny Diner. I forgot about Gypsy. They tried to shut it down because it was too shiny. They built a diner called the Shiny Diner, and then it was too shiny. And didn't they have to go back and like buff the panels out on it to like dull it down? Didn't they have to do that to satisfy the town or something like that? I forget what.
I think they did, yeah.
Yeah,
I think they had to take like sandpaper and buff it down so it wasn't so shiny to to satisfy the town. So it's a good spot. It's good food. I'm a big fan of Gypsies. So this police power is something that every municipality has in North Carolina. Some examples of things that are controlled by zoning. What can the land be used for? That's the biggest example. Is it zoned residential? Is it zoned commercial? Is it allowed for you to build? If it's zoned residential, can you build any type of residential here? Can you build condos? Can you build townhouses? Or does it have to be single family homes? So all those things would be outlined in the zoning. Setbacks, you know, we talked about setback requirements. We've even had some math with setback requirements. So we talked about those and how those might come into play, but setback requirements are an example of something that might be controlled by the zoning, the type of structures, how tall buildings could be. So is it possible that a town could have a building and a zoning ordinance that says no structure in a particular area more than 3 floors tall? Could they have that in their zoning ordinance?
Yes, they can.
Absolutely.
My city.
Minimum parking spaces. You know, like for example, the city of Raleigh has minimum numbers of parking spaces per square foot for different types of developments. If you want to develop office space, then you have to have a certain number of parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of office space. But if you're developing hotel space, then that's a different number of parking spaces that you have to have for every 1,000 square feet. And so It's just very, very detailed restrictions of things that could be controlled by zoning. Now, here's where we've gotten to some of the testing words. I'm going to try to highlight and make sure you know which things are absolutely the most likely to show up on a test. Everything from that first slide where we talked about the difference between public and private. This terminology here, an extraterritorial jurisdiction, is very much fair game for the exam as far as a zoning question goes. I'm just going to give you let me do this. Let's see if I can show you what an extraterritorial jurisdiction looks like here. Let me do a map. Of Raleigh. Okay. So here's a map of Raleigh, and I'm going to do a little screen capture so I can draw on this. Oh, that does not help. It doesn't help. My thing was in the way. There we go. Okay. So here's a map of Raleigh. And, oh, it didn't show. Why did it not show you that? I don't have it shared correctly. You'd think Seth would let me know stuff like that, but
I thought you were in the process of it, but
sure, whatever.
you got.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
I think we're waiting for the unveiling.
The unveiling? Okay. So here's a map of Raleigh. The red outline is the what we call incorporated limits. That's another terminology you need to know. The incorporated limits of something. Incorporated in this case simply means city limits. So incorporated Raleigh. That means just in the city limits.
Do
Now,
incorporated limits always mean city limits?
yes, city or town. Incorporated always means in a city or town limit. So you've got, this line, which I realize is kind of crazy here in some places because you've got like state parks and that sort of thing. But basically, if you look at, kind of the outline of the city of Raleigh, it roughly follows, this boundary right here. Okay, roughly. Now, do you think Raleigh has control over development within that red blob right there? Within the incorporated limits, do you think the city of Raleigh has control over that development?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely they do. What if I told you, let me do a different color here. What if I told you there is a buffer zone that follows that city limits all the way around? But notice where it is. Is it inside the line or is it outside the line?
Outside. Just outside of it.
Just outside of it. This is called an extraterritorial jurisdiction. That little buffer zone outside, that area right there, is called an extraterritorial jurisdiction, or ETJ. This right here is called an ETJ. An extraterritorial jurisdiction is an area, Isabella said, like a neutral zone, sort of, but it's not neutral. This is an area, Isabella, that's actually outside the city limits, but where the city still has zoning authority. So for example, if you found yourself owning a property, like let's say right here. Here's Isabella's house. right there. Is she located in the city of Raleigh?
No.
No.
No. So there are going to be some advantages to that. Give me the advantage to that. No what?
No city taxes.
No city taxes.
Taxes.
That's an advantage. There are also disadvantages to that. She gets no city services. She doesn't get police protection from the city of Raleigh. She doesn't get fire protection from the city of Raleigh. And let me tell you why that's important to Isabella. Here is fire station number 2 for the city of Raleigh. Here is the volunteer fire department that will actually come to Isabella's house if it catches on fire. Is that going to potentially make a difference?
100%.
Absolutely. But she is not located in the city of Raleigh. And people say, well, that's fair. She doesn't pay city taxes. Okay, well, let's talk about fair. Isabella wants to put a shed in her backyard. Guess who she has to check with to see if she can put a shed in her backyard?
Raleigh.
City of Raleigh.
City of Raleigh.
Because even though she's not inside the city limits of Raleigh, she is located within their extraterritorial jurisdiction. Does that make sense for everybody?
Is there a mile-ish of how
Raleigh's is
of that
3
number?
miles.
3?
Raleigh's is 3 miles. That's not on the test, but you asked, so yeah. Raleigh's is 3 miles. It's based on population size, how big of a buffer zone you get. Okay? Does this make sense for everybody? What we're saying when we say there's an extraterritorial jurisdiction? So this, Isabella's not going to deal with the city of Raleigh for anything. She's not going to pay taxes to them. She's not going to get garbage service from them, not going to get water from them, not going to get sewer from them, not going to get fire or police protection from them. But any improvement she wants to make on her property, she's going to have to go to the city of Raleigh and check to see if that's okay, because their zoning is going to control what she can do. John said that Fuquay's ETJ just expanded by the state. They did. It went from 2 miles to 3 miles, I believe, right, John? I think that's correct. It either went from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3. I can't remember, because it's based on population size.
Thomas, I have a question.
Fall under that, or would that be city limits actually expanding?
Both can happen. If the city limits expand, that also pushes the ETJ out. But as population grows, the municipality can apply to the state to actually expand their ETJ without expanding their actual corporate limits.
So essentially, this can keep growing and growing and growing.
It will keep growing and growing and growing. That is correct. Over time.
And this is every city?
Every single one.
Okay.
So then here's my hypothetical is if you live in Garner, would you have to contact the city of Raleigh?
Well, see here, and so that's a good question. When you get down here on the other side of town, here's Cary's boundary. Something like this. Right?
You just have to contact both.
Well, no. If you are in, and so I'll also draw in like Garner for comparison purposes. So here might be Garner's. The people who find themselves in this little area right here, Garner's zoning authority overrides Raleigh's ETJ because they're actually in Garner. So it would be Garner they would have to follow. But it can be terribly confusing because if you contact Raleigh, they'll say, oh yeah, we have control, because they always want control. So it can be very confusing with these ETJs and the way they overlap.
Hey, Travis.
Yes.
So with this information you just gave us, can you like give us an example of what a question would be like? in regards to this particular subject?
The question is going to be, do you understand what an extraterritorial jurisdiction is? It's going to be a definitional question, an absolutely definitional question. So, you know, if it says, you know, an area located outside of the, you know, incorporated limits of a municipality where the municipality still has zoning control is called a, and then the answer is going to be what?
Oh, I see. Okay.
An extraterritorial jurisdiction.
Travis, I don't
So we don't have
understand
to
that.
worry about that buffer.
Go ahead, May.
So I assume each city will be right next to the other city. And how can that bubble happen if
it doesn't? And that's what I'm saying. It doesn't happen if each city is located next to, but there are areas, particularly in other parts of the state, where that is not true. So like, for example, Rollsville's city limits is something like this here. You've got this area between Raleigh and Rollsville that's not in either municipality.
Oh, okay.
And so we need to know who controls that area, if anybody. And of course, if you go further outside of Raleigh, like if you get to Zebulon over here, so let's just say here's Zebulon's, you know, city limits, like right here. Well, then you've got whole areas out here which are not in any municipality. So they would only be subject to county zoning. So don't assume that every property is located in a city. It's not. Does that help?
Does this count for towns or just cities?
Cities and towns are the same thing.
Okay.
What about counties? Does it count counties or no?
Counties have their own zoning for when the property is not located within a city or a town.
But they don't have an ETJ is what I'm asking, a county.
Counties do not have an ETJ because county boundaries always need another county. So when you cross the Wake County, Nash County line, you go from Wake County zoning control to Nash County zoning.
Gotcha. It's just for cities.
Just for cities. Just for cities. Okay? Are we all good on this idea of an ETJ? I find a visual of them. Braden and I used to be their insurance agent. They're crazy, all of them.
From a rules perspective, it just seems so confusing with like cities, counties, towns, you know, and it's like everybody's working on top of everybody.
They are. They are. So basically think of zoning as a, it's a fight. Everybody wants control. Raleigh wants to control as much area as they possibly can. What Cary wants to control as much area as they possibly can. Where they meet each other, you simply follow the city boundaries. It's in these dead areas where that you're not in Raleigh or Cary that they're going to probably fight over who has control. Whose extraterritorial jurisdiction is this? Who has the more authority here? And those things are very confusing sometimes when you have properties that are located in those areas. Okay? So that's the first vocabulary word that's very likely to be tested. The next screen has two that I will say absolutely will be tested. These are not likely to be tested. These will be tested on the national section of the exam. What is the difference between a legal non-conforming use and an illegal use or illegal non-conforming use? Here are
you got permission with one or the other.
Here are the most important words in both phrases. What's most important there? The use is what? Non-conforming. Non-conforming means
you're breaking the law.
Rule breaking. We're not following all of the zoning ordinance. Now, we could be not following it in a big way. And this is where you got to be careful on tests. Some of you are just stubborn. You won't decide which rules are important. That's not your job. Yes, if the property is zoned residential and you open a gas station, is that a non-conforming use?
Yes.
Yes, it is. If the property is zoned residential and you build a house there. But your driveway is 5 feet from the property line, and it says nothing can be constructed within 10 feet of the property line. Is that still a non-conforming use? Even though it's being used for what the zoning says, if it's violating the zoning at all, it's a non-conforming use. So would that be a non-conforming use?
Yes.
Yes.
It absolutely would. So now that we're clear on what non-conforming means, let's talk about the two different varieties of non-conforming. Either legal non-conforming or illegal non-conforming. I think it's easier to understand the illegal version. If you break a rule when the rule is already in effect, that's an illegal non-conforming use. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
So what that means is whatever was done with the property, whatever was constructed on the property, from the minute it was done, constructed, started, whatever, they were breaking the rule because the rule was already in place. Is that good for everybody? So the way to think of an illegal use is the rule was there first. The rule was in place first before the use started. Now, here's the thing about an illegal use, and this is where you're going to have to be careful on the test with this thing. They love to try to talk you out of the idea that it's illegal, because we seem to want to think if you do something illegally long enough, they're just going to magically say, oh, yeah, you can do that. Well, it may work that way for something like adverse possession, but it doesn't work that way for zoning. If it's illegal now, guess what it's going to be 40 years from now? What do you think? Illegal.
Still illegal.
Legal.
So let me give you a hypothetical situation, because you're going to encounter this on the test probably. What if Kenneth buys a property that's being operated as a convenience store? It's in an area zoned strictly residential. The zoning ordinance went into effect in 1975. The convenience store opened in 1978. But it's been operated this entire time as a convenience store. Kenneth purchases the convenience store and continues its operation as a convenience store. What kind of use does he have?
An illegal, non-conforming.
He has an illegal use. He has an illegal use because I said it had been zoned as strictly residential since when? 1975. And the gas station wasn't put there till 1978. So from day one, from the very jumping off point of this thing, that gas station was an illegal use, and it's going to remain an illegal use. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
And here's the thing. Just because it's been allowed to stay there that long, is there any guarantee that the zoning authority is going to allow it to stay there after that?
No.
No.
No. And let me tell you why you have to understand this as a real estate agent. I'm going to give you some practical advice here. In particular, in smaller towns, more rural areas in the state, the people who run the planning and zoning offices in some cases are usually, for lack of a better way to put this, very well connected to people who own property in that municipality. Lots of times well connected beyond what is reasonable. Their brother, their mother, their cousin. These are small places. Could you, as a real estate agent, have a client, let's say you represented Kenneth, and Kenneth wants to buy this little gas station because it's really successful, and the place has been there since 1978. As a buyer's agent, if you represent Kenneth, do you think it would be important to tell him, now, Kenneth, you can buy this if you want to, but it's an illegal use? Do you think it would be your responsibility to tell him that?
Yeah.
Yeah, because he's not connected, and they're coming to take it away right when they transfer ownership.
Got it. That's exactly what could happen. And it does happen all the time. I saw this in Roanoke Rapids last year. Somebody sold a bar up there that was being operated as an illegal use. It had been there 40 some years. They sold it, and a week after they sold it, the planning and zoning office shut it down. Why was it allowed to be there 40 some years? Because the director of planning and zoning was the brother of the guy who owned the bar, and they never bothered to enforce the rule as long as his brother owned it. But as soon as somebody else did, guess what?
Shut it down.
Bye.
And there is no legal protection in the state of North Carolina against that, because the state would simply say, you knew the rule was there when you bought it and you took your chances. I'm just telling you how it could be. You got to remember,
That's
when you get a real
terrible.
estate license, you're taking on responsibility for that stuff. So you need to understand the potential ramifications of an illegal use. Are we all clear on that?
Yes.
Now, for test taking purposes, that is very different than a legal non-conforming use. Well, hopefully you recognize the biggest difference is the first word. Instead of illegal, this use is what?
Legal. Allowed.
Legal. And the reason this use is allowed, even though it still doesn't conform, is the use was there first. In other words, the rules at some point changed. And when the property was put into this use, it was following the rules. But then the rules changed later on. There's nothing about planning and zoning that gives them the authority to make you stop using the property if you were there first for that purpose. You are allowed, as a matter of right in the state of North Carolina, to continue to use the property as long as the use started before the zoning went into effect. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah, I have an example. My mom, she bought property. It was out in the country, and she had a horse. And then they came in and rezoned it and made it completely residential, meaning she couldn't have the horse anymore. So he was written in as a grandfather clause, but she couldn't get another horse. She had, once he was gone, she couldn't get another horse.
Well, and there are going to be limitations on this, you know, because this is an exception. There are going to be limitations on it. So, for example, let's flip the years. Let's say Kenny's buying that gas station. The gas station was built in 1975, but the zoning went into effect in 1978. At that point in time, what kind of use does he have?
Illegal.
He has a legal non-conforming use. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
But as Anthony points out, this is not permanent either. It is very much possible to lose the right to a legal non-conforming use. Some municipalities, for example, don't allow it to be sold and the use to continue. Some have written right in their zoning that if you operate as a legal non-conforming use and you sell the property, the new owner has to come into compliance with the zoning. So they would have to stop whatever they were doing that would violate the use. Now, some don't have that rule, so you'll have to check. If you're working in commercial real estate, it's become very, very important to look and see. In a lot of cases, they won't allow the owners of property that operates as a legal non-conforming use to make improvements to the property. You need a new parking lot? Too bad. Can't do it. You can use your old one. Well, there's potholes out there. Sorry, you're not allowed to improve it. Some municipalities will do that. So even this legal non-conforming use is a dice game. It's a very dicey situation. Is everybody following me on that?
Yes.
But at least it is legal.
Travis, where do you find this information? You're helping a customer, you're looking for a house, and where do you find out?
So
where's this information located?
you would go to the planning and zoning website for the municipality where the property is located, and you want to see a copy of their zoning ordinance map. You want to find the property on the map, and then there'll be like a color-coded key that'll tell you what zone the property is located in. Like in Raleigh, you can go to iMaps, and you can search by the address of the property, and it'll tell you what zone it's in. And then you basically cross-reference that with their zoning ordinances and see what the allowed uses are for that zone.
Okay.
That's just mainly important in commercial real
It
estate.
is important in all property, but vastly more important in commercial real estate, because with residential real estate, generally speaking, you are much more safe to assume that the surroundings are all zoned the same.
Right.
Whereas with commercial, the cutoffs can be, like, for example, our building, our location, which you've been to, Kelly, off of Wake Forest Road, we're on Navajo, right off of Wake Forest Road. The zoning is different for the lot that our building is located on, as opposed to the lot on the corner. The lot on the corner where Denny's is zoned to accommodate restaurant entertainment. The lot we're on is zoned for office space only. And they're literally side by side.
Exactly.
So you would have to research that, because some buyer may come in and say, "Whoa, well, this is a great spot for a little, another little restaurant. You got Denny's right here, and look how busy they are. I'm gonna put a restaurant right here in this building," but you can't do it because it doesn't.
So does that come into play, like if your buyer wants to have like a home daycare, or like a like
anything,
a daycare in their home?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you have to check to see if that's allowed within the zoning, and that's where even in residential, it could be important to research the zoning, because some residential areas allow for home businesses and some don't. There was a lady in Durham recently who had to shut down her business teaching piano lessons because the neighbors complained that she was creating traffic issues with parents sitting out parked in the street waiting to pick up kids after piano lessons. And the complaint was she's operating a home business and that's not allowed in the zoning, and the city shut her down.
Wow.
So, it applies to any use of the property. These are very detailed rules. Okay. Everybody good on these terms so far?
Yeah. Hey, Travis, I got a question.
Okay, Josh.
So, where is there a such code or law to where, or situation, I don't know, to where someone can enforce it and the police can enforce it, and the government can enforce it?
Well, you could have certain situations like the one Beth pointed out earlier, which could violate both private covenants and public laws or restrictions. I mean, there could easily be something that is a violation of both, in which case both entities might enforce it.
I can give you another example. So,
well, I guess because I guess my question is if there's both, where it violates both, is there a specific term?
No.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's what I was. Okay.
Because what's going to happen is the government entity is not going to be concerned with the violation of the covenant, and the neighbors aren't going to be concerned with the violation of the law. It's everybody has their own lane, and so if you want to enforce the rules as a neighbor, you're looking at covenants. If you want to enforce the rules through the government, you better be looking at the law.
Well, Travis, you would think that, but I will tell you, in my old neighborhood, there was people that were really crazy and angry that they weren't on the HOA board anymore and that I was. So they called and reported me to the city for my grass not being cut 1 week.
Well, that's where I don't know if the city has an ordinance against that.
Yeah, Raleigh has an ordinance against the height that your grass can be. And so an inspector from the city came out and wrote me a violation and told me if it happened again, they would send me a $200 fine. If it happened again.
And that's a perfect example of the city or the government entity enforcing their rules. They weren't enforcing a covenant. They were enforcing.
Yeah, but it was a neighbor going to them to enforce something that was also in the HOA documents too, just because.
Right, so it might have been a violation of both in that case. Now, the next term that you definitely need to know, and it will be tested. There are a few things I say you're going to see a test question about this. And honestly, folks, there's no reason to miss this one, but people do. If you want to use the property in a manner that is not allowed by the zoning ordinance, I'm not talking about covenants, I'm talking about zoning ordinances. You've got to separate them in your brain. They have to be separate in your brain. If you want to operate in a manner that violates the zoning ordinance, you can ask for permission to do so. That permission is called a variance. This is permission to break the rules? Who would you go to ask for that kind of permission, do you think?
The
The
planning
local
and
government.
zoning.
Zoning board.
You would go to the planning and zoning board. Now, this doesn't have to be a big break of the rules. If they say your house has to be 30 feet from the street and you need to, because of the foundation and rocks, you need to put it 28 feet from the street. Would that be a violation of the zoning if they say that it's 30 feet setback?
Yes.
It would. So before you can do that, you would need to go to the planning and zoning office and ask for what?
A variance.
A variance. Now, let's talk about how hard it is to get a variance. It is almost impossible.
Even something as simple as what you mentioned, like the 2 feet thing?
Yes. Because
Wow.
here's their answer. Build the house 2 feet shorter.
Yeah, you have to prove that it's harming you.
So Kenneth is right, and this will be tested. How do you get a variance? What do you have to prove to get a variance? To obtain a variance, you have to prove dire harm. Like the rule is killing you. You can't use the property for any other purpose. And you have to prove that the rule only harms you. If you say the rule, if you're applying for a variance and you go in there and you say, this rule screws everybody in the neighborhood, your request will immediately be denied. Because what they would say to you is, then you don't need to ask for a variance, you need to propose rezoning the whole area. If it's really true that this rule is just making it impossible for everybody, then we need to look at potentially rezoning the whole area. We're not going to give you a variance because a variance would be just for you. So to get a variance, and they're going to test you on this, you have to prove that you have been harmed, and then you have to prove that that harm is you and you alone, and you have to prove that the harm is so big that you basically can't use the property for anything else.
Hey, Travis. So could that be like an example of like maybe somebody who needed a wheelchair ramp that they couldn't build too close, and you know the grade of the wheelchair ramp versus how long they needed to be, so forth and so on? Could that be an example of something you'd ask for a variance?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you, I'll show you an example of maybe a potential variance case. Let's say we've got a subdivision that sits off the highway here, and it's just a little cul-de-sac subdivision, okay? And you've got lot number 1, lot number 2, lot number 3 here at the back, lot number 4, and lot number 5. 5 lots in the subdivision, and this is your main highway down here. Okay, pretty common thing. The city has zoning ordinances that say, number 1, this can only be used residential. So this is residential only. All right, no problem. That's what we want to do. And so here's the thing. I own lot number 3. That's my lot. And it's no problem that they want it to be residential. That's what I want to build. I want to build a house. So no problem. We shouldn't have a problem there. And so I start looking, okay, it's residential, and the lot size has to be at least 1/3 of an acre, or a half of an acre, 1/3 of an acre. No problem. My lot's a half an acre. It's big enough. Okay. And then I start looking at the rules, and it says, okay, there are 10-foot side setbacks. What that means is on any lot in this subdivision, there's these imaginary lines on the ground 10 feet from the property line where we can't do what? What can we
Can't
do?
build.
Can't use it.
And build.
Can't build there, right? So every lot's got these 10-foot setbacks where you can't build. No problem. I can put a house there, no big deal. Oh, we're not done yet. There's a 30-foot front setback. Okay, so basically I can't build anything within 30 feet of the front of any of these lots. All right, well, now you're kind of cramping my style, but okay, whatever. Here's why I bought this lot in the first place. It's got the best feature in the back of it. I wanted to be able to go fishing, and there's a little creek that runs across the back here. Beautiful. Oh, there's a creek on your lot. That's nice. Did we mention that there's a 50-foot setback from any water source? So, look at lot number 3.
You better build a tiny home.
Where's it going to go?
Yeah, you can't build a home in that space.
There ain't going to be no home.
Because if I put it here, I'm violating the rear setback, correct?
Yep.
If I put it here, I'm violating the front setback. If I put it over here, I'm violating the rear, the side, and the front setback. There's literally nowhere for me to use that lot. That is a good case for a variance. I would go to the Planning and Zoning Board and I would say, there is no way I can follow all of these rules that you've got over here and still actually use my lot. I need a variance on at least one of these. Which one are they most, or both, are they most likely to give me some variance on?
The front or the back?
Probably the front and the back. So what they might say is, okay, for you, you only have a 20-foot front setback and you only have a 20-foot rear setback on the water. And so they still wouldn't give me much room, but they would give me at least enough to do something with the property through a variance.
I don't understand why the developers would even build this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Why would the developers even build this or be allowed to?
Because remember, these zoning ordinances could have been put in place long after the lot was already developed. For all we know, these lots have been in existence for 50 years and nobody ever did anything with it. And then they came along and they changed the zoning ordinance. Well, now I need to build and I have to comply with the new zoning ordinance. Okay, is everybody all right on that?
Uh-huh.
So anytime we are going to the planning and zoning office and asking for an exception, we're asking for what?
A variance.
For a variance, okay? Do you ask for, or do you need to ask for a legal non-conforming use?
Legal
non-conforming use.
Do you need to ask for it?
No, because
because you were what?
We're there
already doing it in the first place.
You were there first.
Yeah.
That's going to be the big differentiator on the test. If you're asking for, give me a break, man, you're asking for a variance. Is everybody okay on that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what they're going to focus on the test. As far as, no, you're not okay, Isabella. Is that right, or is that what you're saying?
No, she was saying answering your question.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I just want to make sure. I see no over there, and I want to make sure we were not leaving somebody behind. Good. So some other things that the municipality might, or the government might enforce. Subdivision regulations. Now, as Kelly mentioned earlier, these are not covenants, because covenants are not enforced by the government. These are the rules about creating a subdivision. So subdivision creation. This is when you have one big piece of land and the developer wishes to break it up into smaller pieces of land. Now, there is no limit in North Carolina on how many lots you have to break something down into to create a subdivision. If you have one piece of land and you break it into two pieces of land, guess what you just created legally in North Carolina?
A subdivision.
A subdivision. The rules are the same whether you're breaking it down into 2 lots or 222 lots. It does not matter. You are creating a subdivision. Is everybody with me on that? And you have to follow exactly the same steps when you're creating a subdivision. So as an example, my grandfather gave my mother an acre of land in 1972 when she got married from his farm to build a house. Well, to give her that piece of land, he had to do what? Take it out of the farm. So what did that create?
Subdivision.
A subdivision with 2 lots. One lot that was 144 acres and one lot that was 1 acre. Because what he did was took 1 acre out of the 145 acre farm. But that's still creation of the subdivision. No, Anthony, we're not going to talk about conditional use permits. They don't test those. And so it's just not a good use of our time. Okay.
Travis, quick question on that.
Yep.
Going back, I know you said that the farm, I guess it's the same farm that was gifted to your grandfather. So when he passed and it went to the children's home,
different.
It's a different one. Okay, cool. Because I want to ask if it was the same farm, how did your mom contain?
She would have lost ownership if that were the case.
Right, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, okay, cool.
That was a neighboring farm. He had his farm, his family farm, and then the life estate was on the neighboring farm.
Okay, all right, cool.
Yeah. Now, whether we're doing 1 lot, 2 lots, 22 lots, doesn't matter. They all follow the same rules. These are the steps to creating a subdivision in North Carolina. Subdivisions start here at a plat map. A plat map is just a map drawing of a subdivision. As a matter of fact, this is a plat map. This is, whatever subdivision is, this is the Happy Acres subdivision. And if you wanted to find this plat map, it might be in the Wake County Book of Maps, book number 1972, page number 504. And so that's how you would go find the plat map. You would go to the county courthouse and you would say, I want to see the plat map of the Happy Acres subdivision, and here's the book number and here's the page number, and there is your plat map. There's the picture of your subdivision. Because here's what this used to be. Happy Acres used to be how many pieces of land?
1.
It was 1. And then somebody divided it. Isabella says, so this subdivision is going to require a new deed, right? Well, Isabella, how many lots did we have before?
1.
How many lots do we have now?
5.
We have 5. And so when we start to, remember, we only use a deed when we convey ownership. No, there would not be a new deed simply because we subdivided, because just because we're subdividing doesn't mean we're actually conveying ownership. We could subdivide and the same person owns all 5 lots. But when and if we do start selling these lots off, each one of them would have a separate deed because now they are separate pieces of land. Okay, so this process starts at this preliminary plat map. You're welcome. It starts here. And the word preliminary is important. What does the word preliminary mean? Anytime you use the word preliminary, what does that mean?
It's kind of like a draft. It's not permanent. It's just initial.
Right? It's initial. It's the planning stages, right? So let's say we file this as our preliminary plat map. Happy Acres subdivision. This is what it looks like. Lots 1 through 5. We got it filed. It's not final, as a couple of you said. John said it in the chat. Kenny said it. It's not final, meaning we can come back and make what to it?
Changes.
There is going to be a limit to how long we have to make changes. Now, that's not a time limit. The state doesn't care how long you want to take to make changes. What the state does care about, though, is there's one really important thing you can't do until you're done with all your changes. Look at this last one down here at the bottom. It says lots can be conveyed. That's the very end of the process. So let's say Seth has written a contract and Seth wants to buy over here lot number 1. We cannot sell any lot in this subdivision until we finalize the plat map for the whole subdivision. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
We can't convey ownership of lot number 1 to Seth until we finalize the plat map for lots 1 through 5, because that's the whole subdivision. So here's going to be a problem. Let's say we sell lot number 1 to Seth and we close on it. Now Seth's building his house over there. 20 years down the road, we realize we made a mistake over here on lot number 5 and we put this property line in a place we didn't mean to put it. Can we fix that problem?
No.
No, it cannot be fixed, because in order to get to the point of selling and closing that lot to Seth, we had to finalize the plat map. Is that clicking for everybody? You've got to lock it in as final before you can actually convey ownership to anybody of any of those lots. So is it really important for the developer to make sure all the kinks are worked out in this plat map before they close on one of these lots to somebody?
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. If they closed on that one and then they decided later that they wanted to combine that like small lot with the other one, would they have to go back in and do a new re-subdivision? Could they go back in and do the whole process all over again, or no?
They probably could if they still own both of the lots, and depending on what the covenant said and if the covenants allowed for it, but it would not be easy to accomplish. It would not be a very straightforward process at all. Because the whole idea of finalizing this thing is locking it in forever.
Travis, what about the terminology conveyed? What does that mean here?
Convey means transfer ownership.
Transferred, okay.
Record a deed, transfer ownership. New person now owns the property. And here's why that's a really important question, and I'm glad you asked, Melissa. Look at way back here, step number 2. What does it say can happen at step number 2?
Contract.
We can write what?
Contracts.
Contracts. So can Seth go under contract on lot number 1 before the final plat map is recorded?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. Can we take a deposit from him on lot number 1?
Yes.
Before the
You can. Yes.
We can, but we can't actually close. We can't transfer ownership to Seth until we go and finalize the plat map. Here's what I will tell you.
So if we can't figure it out, does it go back, does deposit and all that stuff go back to Seth?
If they can't finalize the plat map, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, if they can't get to step 3, if everybody can't come to an agreement.
Then yes, they would have to refund his money. And if they had to make a change on the plat map before they finalize it, they'd have to give him an opportunity to get out and get all his money back. Even if the change wasn't on lot number 1, if the change was anywhere on the plat map. Because
So it's more like a reservation fee.
That's
more
it.
like a hold.
That's it. So the only way they can hold him to that reservation is if they make no changes from the time he signs the contract to the time they finalize the plat map. Is everybody following on that kind of idea?
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's what I'll tell you. This is why, how many of you have ever been into like a new home construction office and they have this huge map, and clearly there are going to be lots that are going to be opened up later, but you'll say, well, what about this lot? Oh, that one's not available. That's in our next phase. How many of you ever heard somebody say that in like a new home set? That next phase
happened where I bought.
That next phase is actually a whole separate subdivision. And the reason for that is because because of this progression, they need to keep the subdivision, the plat maps, small. They need to work with only a certain number of lots at a time, Because if they start opening up and taking deposits on lots back here, they have to lock in those plat maps way sooner than they want to. And so that's why they will do it in phases like that.
It's kind of like 12 Oaks out in Holly Springs.
Yeah, lots of neighborhoods are done that way.
Wait,
Okay?
did you say that they're like completely different they have to be different neighborhoods?
They are different subdivisions. Legally, they are different subdivisions.
Okay. Because there's like 8 different phases in my neighborhood, but they're all considered the same subdivision.
Well, they are all considered the same by us, but legally they're all separate.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you look at the subdivision name, it'll say, you know, Holly Meadows Phase 1, Holly Meadows Phase 2. Well, technically, in the eyes of the law, those are 2 separate subdivisions. Now, we treat them like they're the same, but from a legal perspective, they're 2 different.
Thanks.
Okay. Now, test question probably come from this slide right here because it involves us. Who would write contracts on these lots? Who would take deposits on these lots? It would be us, right? So they're going to want to know when that process can begin. When can we start the process of, I lost y'all. What just happened? Can y'all see and hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's so weird. I just lost you on the screen.
We hear you, Travis.
Yeah, I hear y'all.
Looking around.
I hear y'all too. I don't know how you.
Marco.
There we go. All of a sudden, my screen on the wall went blank, and you moved over here to the other side. So I don't know what's happening. Maybe it means it's time to take a break. I guess I don't know. But anyhow, so these phases are just a response to that. That's what happens. Is we have these different phases, and this is a response to that. But the test question might be, when can we start to write contracts? When can we?
The plat map has been recorded.
And that's it. That's exactly right. We can begin to write contracts when the plat map has been recorded. When the preliminary plat map has been recorded. We cannot convey ownership until the final plat map has been recorded. Okay, and that's about all you need to know about that. Last sort of thing I would point out about subdivision development in North Carolina, you may very well see a question about streets. And I don't want to launch a long discussion about this because it tends to confuse you on the test. Here's what you need to understand about streets in North Carolina. The streets you see are private streets. When I say private, that means they're not maintained by the government. They're not owned by the government. That should be your basic assumption. Then you go verify. If you want to say they're public, make sure they're public first. This is a huge deal. And they're going to test you on this. So streets are private until they're public. Why do you think it would be a big deal for a street to be private instead of public? Why could that potentially be a big deal?
To be maintained by DOT.
That's right. Who's maintaining it? Because if it's a private street, it's going to be maintained by the individual property owners, which can be very expensive. Now, what I want to point out to you here is that if the streets are going to be made public, there's 2 steps to getting them to be public. Not 1 step, but 2 steps. And they will try to trip you up on this on the test. Step 1 is that the streets are dedicated to public use. Step 2, the streets have to be accepted. They are not public until both of these things have happened. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Street remains a private street until it has been both dedicated and accepted. Both of those have to have happened.
Is that accepted by whoever owns it currently, or like the neighborhood?
Accepted by the state. Accepted by the state, because you're trying to turn them into public. You're trying to give them to the state. It's the state who would accept them.
Okay. Do they ever reject it?
Yes, often. Often. Because what happens is they don't want to take over anything that's not perfect. When a developer builds the streets, if they don't build them to the standards of the state, and then they try to convert them over and say, well, here's this, I'm dedicating the streets to the state of North Carolina. Well, the state's going to send out an inspector, and the inspector goes, you're not dedicating these streets to us. These are garbage. We're not taking these over. These are going to fall apart in 10 years. So if you want them to be public streets, you got to tear them up and redo them. And a lot of times the process breaks down right there. The developer doesn't want to spend the money, and so the streets may never become public streets.
So when you see on the street sign, you see where it says private street, those are the streets that are private, or are they just saying they're private because they don't want you to drive on them?
Every street is a private street until you have verified that it's public. You cannot trust the road signs.
Okay.
Because the state of North Carolina has done a horrible job of differentiating them over the years.
At my job, the street says private, but I know that it's a public street because I've called the city to maintain the sewer system plenty of times, and they've argued with me about it.
That's been the problem. They started adding those flags years ago for private streets, but they're not accurate. And there's thousands of streets around the state that don't say private street, but are private streets. Ben asked, where would you find if it's public or private? You have to go to the North Carolina Department of Transportation. You contact the Department of Transportation. The street sign will have an SR number on it. That's a state road number. You give them the state road number, you give them the approximate location, and they will tell you if that's publicly maintained or privately maintained.
Travis,
go ahead, Melissa. Go ahead.
That first one where it says developers are responsible for construction approval, conversion to public ownership.
Yep.
Can that ever be done by the owners of the lots, or does that have to be the developer?
In some cases, it has to be when the developer bolts and leaves. It's very common for developers to not finish this process because nobody's paying attention. Here's what happens. I'm going to just tell y'all the honest truth. Travis Everette would never purchase a new construction house in a neighborhood that's still being built, ever. Because what I can guarantee you 100% is that those streets are private streets. The state will not take over roads in a neighborhood that is under construction because they know there is a very high likelihood the roads will get destroyed by construction equipment. And so when the developer finishes the neighborhood, that's when they'll try to convert them to public roadways. Well, put yourself in the shoes of the developer. You're finished. You've sold every lot in the neighborhood. Here comes an inspector from the state and they say, yeah, it looks pretty good, but you need to do these 3 things. And you get a quote, and those 3 things are going to cost you $482,000 to have done to the streets in that neighborhood. Meanwhile, nobody in the neighborhood's paying attention. They assume the streets are public anyway. What do you think a lot of developers in that situation do?
They just leave.
They just leave. And nobody knows that happened until 15 or 20 years down the road when the streets start to break down. And then everybody starts calling the city saying, come fix these potholes. And the city says, these are not our streets. These are your streets. You fix the potholes. You repaid. And what I'm telling you is there is no statute of limitations to you being sued as a real estate agent over time if you disclose this incorrectly. So you need to verify it. You need to verify, are these public streets or are they private streets?
Hey, Travis, so it sounds like we, as the broker, we need to check a whole lot of things. Well, first question is there a list published out there that we can follow? Second is, in reality, do the real estate broker really check all these things when they get a listing or helping a buyer?
I know one who does, and I know another one who's in this room who better because I'm his broker in charge. So yes, some of us do. But that's also one of the things that you rely on for your rely on your broker in charge for. They should be able to give you sort of checklists about those kinds of things that need to be investigated and checked as you go. Because every transaction is a little bit different.
So if I were a buying agent, for sure, I have to check this. But what if I'm a listing?
Absolutely. we're going to talk about in chapter 7, we're going to talk about something called material facts, things that must be disclosed. And so it would be listing agents that would definitely have to be on their toes about checking for this, because they'd be required to disclose it.
I see. Thank you.
You're welcome. And Braden's drag racing on the private streets. Just make sure they're private. I'll tell you a funny story, and then I'll move on from this. My parents' neighborhood up at Lake Gaston has private streets, and my mom and dad years ago were working the members of the HOA, and their HOA is very small and not all that involved, and just a bunch of people that like each other. So there's no issues there. But the HOA wanted the state to take over maintenance of the streets, primarily because when it snowed, because they're up there on the Virginia line, when it snows, they want somebody to come in and plow. And so they started the conversation with the state of North Carolina about what it would take to convert the streets to private streets. And the state sent an inspector in and actually gave them a list of things that need to be done, and they got it priced out, and it's going to cost about $180,000. They had some money saved up in the HOA, and everybody voted, yeah, let's spend the money, let's go ahead and make the streets up to the state standards, so they'll take them over. So they brought the state inspector back out there for one last meeting. Here's what we're going to do. We want to make sure this will take care of all the issues, and then you'll take them and they'll become public streets. Well, when they went to meet the state inspector, everybody in my parents' neighborhood drives a golf cart around all the time. None of them drive cars. They all drive golf carts.
Well, that became state. I understand.
So here come, 8 old men on their golf carts driving up to go meet with the state inspector down at the pool in the neighborhood. And he looks at them, he said, now everything looks good on your plans, but you all do understand that once these are state roads, you're not gonna be able to drive those golf carts in here anymore.
Unless they're certified.
And they said, what do you mean? They said, well, you can't have a golf cart on a state maintained roadway. That ended the discussion right there of becoming a public roadway. They didn't want to be public anymore. They figured out that, no thank you, it was worth riding the golf carts. So, but as long as property owners understand what they've got, that's fine. Our job is to make sure they know what they got. Okay. Don't worry about the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. That's not something they'll likely test you on. It's largely been made irrelevant over time. Obviously, we have a duty to disclose, and we're going to talk more about that in chapter 7. So I'm going to leave that alone for now. We'll talk about that duty to disclose. Building codes are the last example of a public land use control or a government-based land use control. Their primary function is safety. So building codes are minimums. Building codes don't say this is, how you should build something. A building code doesn't say this is the way it should be built. A building code says this is the minimum process. This is the minimum level to which it must be built. And the primary goal is safety. Understand the difference between the permit and the certificate of occupancy. This is at the beginning. And this is at the end. Before you make the improvement, you are required to obtain a building permit. Once the improvement has been made, you obtain a certificate of occupancy. In between these two are the inspections. So if you're going to make an improvement to a property, what do you go apply for at the very beginning?
A permit.
A permit. You're issued the permit. You do the work. And then you call back the permitting office and they come out and they do what?
An inspection.
An inspection. And assuming the work has met the building codes, then they will issue you a what?
Certificate of occupancy.
Certificate of occupancy. That is the improvement process. And they never issue it the first time, Jessica says. Probably true. Flood hazard regulations, just another type of government control. Basically, flood zones are regulated by the federal government. The maps are drawn by FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So whether or not something is in a flood hazard area is often designated by the federal government. And the federal government also administers the National Flood Insurance Program, which just got refunded not too long ago. It's very important to people, particularly in Eastern North Carolina. But just recognize that flood hazard and flood insurance is a federal deal. You don't have to worry about this slide right here. Don't focus too much yet on the Americans with Disabilities Act, but it is a public land use control. And the reason this is a public control is it only applies to public buildings. Places in the what? Public. Notice down here, it does not apply to residential properties. Is everybody with me on that?
Question?
Yes.
Yes. Did you say?
Sorry. Yeah, I clicked off. Does that include sidewalk access?
The Americans with Disabilities Act applies to any public facility. So any sidewalk, most likely, I cannot imagine how it would not be considered a public facility.
So when you get a chance, I want to bounce some of your expertise off of my expertise in another area to see if you can help me figure out a conundrum that I'm in with a resident.
Okay, all right. So one thing I will say about the Americans with Disabilities Act is it requires equality of access, regardless of someone's physical or mental handicap. And we're going to talk about much more in detail when we get to the fair housing chapter about what different physical and mental handicaps there might be. But just for your purposes right now, understand that properties that are located in the public domain must be accessible to the public. You know, an example of things that you see, restrooms that are handicap accessible in public facilities, even swimming pools at hotels. What have you noticed? Most hotels, if not all now, have beside the swimming pool
A lift.
A lift chair.
And in neighborhoods, they have that. But
neighborhoods have to, especially newer ones, as they're constructed in order to obtain approval. A certain number of handicap accessible parking spaces, door handles that can be operated with levers, not knobs. All of those are requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's also the act that requires people be admitted with service animals to places of public accommodation. Now, I'm going to point out, what did it say down here on the bottom right? This law does not apply to what?
Residential properties.
Residential properties. It blows my mind. I've been in this business a long time, and it still blows my mind the number of real estate agents that will say, well, you have to admit that dog because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. That tenant, you have to give them right to access that, you know, that service animal because of the Americans with Disabilities Act. There might be a law that says you have to admit that animal, and we're going to talk about whether there is or not later on down the road. But it ain't the Americans with Disabilities Act, because that law does not apply to what?
Residential
So
property.
Travis, would that lift not apply since it's a residential neighborhood?
But that's a great question. The neighborhood is residential, but the pool is for
I would
what?
say it's a public pool.
It's for the public, at least all members of that community. Apartment complex would be the same way. The publicly accessible areas would be subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act, but the units themselves would not be.
And I guess that would be the same in a residential neighborhood that had a community pool.
Correct.
You know, it's residential, but it's got a community pool too.
That's exactly right. So for example, like Ben's question about an apartment complex, if a tenant comes in and demands that the owner of the property take out the tub and install a roll-in shower, the owner of the property does not have to do that. But if the tenant says, I can't access my apartment because the sidewalks are not handicap accessible, the owner of the apartment complex would be obligated to make that change because that change is being made in the publicly accessible portion of the facility.
I have a quick question. So when you're saying public, you mean for the public use and not owned by public, correct?
Correct. I mean, available for public use. I don't mean just not, that's a great question. Not publicly owned, but publicly accessible. So basically, you're talking retail facilities, office spaces,
churches,
restaurants, churches, anything like that.
Bathrooms.
Community gathering.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, public restrooms, all those kinds of things.
Hey, Travis.
Yes.
I think you kind of confused me, or you probably went out when you was explaining it. So like a therapy dog in an apartment building, that does or does not fall under ADA? Because last time I checked,
not fall under ADA.
So how come they? It seems like all you gotta do is tell a property manager, and then they don't ask for no paperwork.
I didn't say, Josh, that there weren't other laws that might require that. What I said was, and this is what you have to be careful about on the test, is the ADA does not require that because the ADA is not in effect in a residential property.
Oh, okay. Okay. I knew I was missing something. All right. Thanks.
There very well might be other laws, and we'll talk about those later, but that would not apply to the ADA.
Gotcha. Okay.
But now that service animal at a restaurant would most definitely fall under the ADA.
Oh, okay.
Travis, one more question. When it says new commercial buildings and then older public buildings, does that mean that older buildings that aren't undergoing remodeling aren't held to that standard?
They are not held to the same standard. Older facilities generally are given the option to make what's called an accommodation rather than a modification. An accommodation might not require changing the actual facility. Like, for example, hotels that have pre-existing pools are offered the option of either making a modification or an accommodation for that pool. Modification, they can install the chairlift. Accommodation, they can have staff available during pool hours to lift a person in or out of the pool when they need to be lifted in or out of the pool. So they're not required to make the change in the property because it was already there first, but they are required to provide access in another method. But with new construction or renovation, you're required to make the changes.
Okay, thank you.
But you have to provide the access one way or the other. Like, for example, you know, you and I are from Tarboro. The post office in Tarboro is a great example. There's no way they can make a modification to that building to make it handicap accessible. I mean, you think about the post office on Main Street, it's 30-some stairs straight up from the street, big, broad granite staircase. So they've made an accommodation. If you cannot do those stairs, you pull around back and they have a buzzer you press and they send somebody running down to give you your mail. So it can be accomplished with either accommodation or modification. We talked about covenants all the time, but as we mentioned early on, if we are talking about covenants, these are private controls. They are not enforced by any government group or government agency. These private land use controls are enforced by private landowners. How does one owner enforce these rules against another owner in the same subdivision? What do we say must happen?
Individually.
Take them to court.
Take them to court. And how many does it take? Does it take a group of owners or
No.
just what?
Just one owner.
One.
Just one owner. Just one. Just one. That's it. There doesn't have to be an HOA. By the way, do you think they were going to put HOA as an answer choice on the test?
Yes.
They certainly will, and it will be the wrong answer. Okay. This last note down here is going to be probably another area where you might struggle on the test, but you've just got to accept, yes, the whole test is multiple choice. You'll have to accept what I'm about to say. Once you accept this, you won't miss these questions. Once you accept it, you will miss these questions. Whenever you're dealing with multiple sets of rules, and you often are, because you could have, let me ask this question. Could the same property have covenants and have zoning ordinances? Is that
Yes.
not only possible, but likely?
Yep.
It's common.
Yes.
Very common. If there is a property that has both covenants and zoning, is it possible from time to time that the two don't agree with each other?
Yes.
Yes.
Where one says one thing and the other says the other. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
They're going to ask you a test question about which one you follow in that case. And one of the answer choices that they're going to almost always give you is you follow the zoning because that's a government control, and government controls are more important than private controls.
No.
Folks, that's the
No.
wrong answer.
Follow the strictest rule.
You follow the stricter of the two. Another way of saying that is you follow both sets of rules. You can't do anything that violates either set of rules. So here's the best way I know to give you, I'll give you an analogy that's not real estate related. How many of you, when you were growing up, had a curfew, the time you had to be in? How many of you had a different curfew from your mom and your dad? Like if you asked one what time you had to be home, that was with me. I asked mom, what time I need to be home? 10. I go ask my dad, what time I need to be home? I don't know, midnight sounds all right. All the time. All the time. Right? Here's what I learned. I could come home at 11:30, 11:45. Sure. And I would not be in trouble with dad. But that didn't do nothing for mama. And guess what daddy won't gonna do? He won't
Go against
Protect
mama.
you.
He won't gonna step up to the plate and be like, oh no, honey, I told him he could come home midnight. He'd be like,
Nope.
you're on your own. If your mama told you to be home at 10 o'clock, you should have known better than ask me in the first place. That's exactly the way this works. If you've got two sets of rules, figure out which one is more strict, and that's the one you follow. So for example, if the covenants say no fences over 6 feet tall, and the zoning says no fences over 8 feet tall,
Don't go over 6.
and also no chain link.
You're going to follow both
Now,
of them.
the covenants don't say anything about chain link, but they say nothing over 6 feet tall.
So you follow both rules.
The zoning says no chain link and nothing over 8 feet tall.
Wood fence that's 5 feet tall.
What's the maximum height of your fence?
5.9 feet. Wooden.
6 feet, right? And it better not be made out of what?
Chain link.
Chain link, because you can't break rules on either side. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah. So you follow both rules.
You follow both rules. You got to find the sweet spot to put up a fence that follows both rules. And so when you see a test question about that, just remember that. I follow all the rules. Okay. The one other thing I will point out, and I don't have a slide about this, but let me point it out to you. Unfortunately, there could come a time in the real world, and they may ask this question on the test as well. There could very well come a time when you are faced with covenants that you find very distasteful for any number of reasons. I mean, maybe you just don't like the fact that somebody tells you got to put your garage door down. Okay, you can find that distasteful. But could it go even further than that? Could there be covenants? Because how long do covenants last, by the way? How long do these things last?
Forever.
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 There are appurtenances. And these are human beings that write these appurtenances, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Mostly developers. I want y'all to be real honest with yourselves right now. Developers, we're located in a geographic area of the country in particular, that if a subdivision was developed the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, even into the 1960s in Raleigh, North Carolina, is there at least a decent chance that the developer of that subdivision may have chosen to include certain restrictions in those covenants that by today's standards would be illegal?
Yes.
Absolutely.
That by any measure were grotesque, but by today's standards would be illegal. Discriminatory statements like, you know, no members of certain racial or ethnic groups allowed, you know, whatever terminology would have been used. I'm not going to glorify it with using it, but, you know, y'all know where I'm coming from, right? Is everybody with me on this? It is very likely that you'll run across those things. Here's the problem. How long do these appurtenances last?
Forever.
Forever. They're not going to go away. They're going to be there. As disgusting as they are, they're going to be there. In the real world and on the test, this is how you deal with that. Any covenants that are in place that violate current law are not to be followed. So if are there laws currently, which we haven't talked about them yet, but I'm hoping you realize there are there laws currently, for example, that prevent the discrimination of people on the basis of race?
Yes.
Yes. So any statement that was discriminatory in that manner in a covenant would be illegal by today's standards. You just ignore it. And I get that that's an unfulfilling answer. I wish there was a way to get rid of them too. But for test taking purposes and for practical purposes, what you need to know is that if you see any covenants that violate current laws, they are unenforceable. They just are ignored.
Heard that.
And that is it for chapter.
Krista asked if that would be, I don't know how to say that. Latches.
Latches.
Would
it be deemed latches? So that's a, you know, Christina, first of all, I compliment you. I haven't had anybody actually ask me about that terminology in a long time. Generally speaking, no. Latches has to do with basically people failing to put forth claims and all that sort of thing over time. But it is realistically not an excuse anymore. You know, it's just it basically means that latches basically means if somebody doesn't do something that they're legally supposed to do, they might lose the right to it over time. But that's not necessarily the case here. What they would focus on the test more specifically is just the unenforceability of them. Good question.
I thought she might have been saying ratchet. No, I'm just kidding.
No. He was not discussing you.